Family. As I dozed beside Amelia, I thought back to my first marriage. 1855 had proved busy. Kiefer sent me out on a number of missions to check surveys and sniff out problems. Indeed, I got to see quite a lot of what used to be called Upper Canada. Since the Bytown 2 Prescott Railway ran its first train on Christmas Day, 1854, I had been able to get to what was now called Ottawa. In fact, the railway changed its name during 1855 to use Ottawa rather than Bytown. It was not until the last day of 1857 that Queen Victoria decided to make Ottawa the capital of Canada. When I visited there first in the summer of 1855, it was a rough and tumble lumber town. Not for some years did it grow into a town that could truly present the face of a nation. However, Colonel John By's canal was of great interest to my engineer's brain. His calculations achieved an accuracy of 6 inches in 120 miles in the water levels that are critical to running a canal without pumped water. He correctly forecast that steamboats would need larger lock widths than traditional English canals. Several railways were busy laying track across both Upper and Lower Canada, and I was here, there, and everywhere. Before the bridge opened, I had ridden the whole way from Sarnia in the west to Fraserville in the east, though most people call the latter town Rivière-du-Loup. And there were many side journeys and detours related to my engineering work, as well as to my curiosity. So I was not much in Montreal, and Mme. Dubé saw less of Joseph and me than she or we would like. Moreover, Geraldine was left a more or less unmarried widow for much of the year 1855. Nonetheless, we announced our intentions late in that year, and were married on the 5th of January 1856 in the old Christchurch Cathedral, not long before it burned down. D4. It being the middle of winter, we went by sleigh to the church. The ceremony was small. Joseph stood up for me, and several colleagues were there too. Geraldine was supported by her aunt and uncle, and Lisette Tremblay was her witness. We repaired afterwards to a nearby establishment that was something between a cafe and an inn, where we gave our few guests a good lunch, and they gave us their good wishes. I gave Geraldine a small wedding ring and a new coat as presents. Our friends gave us a number of welcome items for our household, which was most generous of them, and materially aided our comfort. Aunt and Uncle Ogilvy gave us a small painting of a scene of early Quebec by the artist Krieghoff. At the time, I thought it an odd present, but it rests now on the wall of my office, and has, I believe, much appreciated in value since the artist has become a favorite of those who dictate fashion. At the time we married, he was becoming known and rather popular, and was one of the few members of his profession to be able to live by his canvases, but even now not considered a grand master. In preparation for marriage, we had arranged the rental of a small house not too far from the railway depot in the western part of the town. There was much building going on as Montreal was expanding vigorously. Soon we would purchase land and erect one of the new dwellings. For now we had a modest house, and found ourselves there in the late Saturday afternoon. It was already getting dark, so I lit a pair of candles. We could have used oil lamps, but kerosene, the English say paraffin, was not then available, and whale oil was, on balance, more expensive. We had engaged a local girl to come in and ensure the stove was fed sufficient wood to keep the house warm. At this stage, we did not have running water in the house and still used chamber pots. Indoor toilets were the preserve of the affluent. To our pleasant surprise, there was a pot of venison stew keeping warm on the edge of the stove where it would not burn. We both enjoyed a hearty bowl, then simply went to bed, Geraldine preceding me. Given the cold, though the stovepipe passed through our bedroom, we both maintained our nightgowns throughout. Both of us were inexperienced in the manner of conjugal activities, but with humor and fumbling, we achieved a consummation. I do not recall that Geraldine was either particularly pained or excited on the first occasion. In the morning, we tried again and found ourselves happy to be joined and able to share affection and laughter while united. I think that was a pattern maintained throughout our whole marriage. That is, there was respect, comfort, and affection, and a love that was more than adequate to a lifelong partnership. But having known and loved Amelia, there was not the overarching passion that hits like waters tumbling over Niagara. However, we did not, at least I did not know what was absent. I believe it was the same for Geraldine. Our activities in the first month were sufficient that our son George was born at the beginning of October of 1856. The GTR had opened the line as far as Brockville in November 1855, then Oshawa to Toronto in August. And when George was hardly 3 weeks old, I had to attend the opening of the full line of Montreal to Toronto. Despite being mother to an infant, Geraldine, in partnership with Lisette, maintained her bookkeeping work. Indeed, it was sufficiently lucrative that they could engage local women and girls to handle their everyday household tasks. My own activities were also progressing. At that time, there were many engineering and railway works underway in Canada. Ottawa had its link to the GTR via Prescott, coming into the town at the Rideau River, near where that river tumbles into the Ottawa River. Indeed, the railway was terminating for some time to the eastern side of the Rideau before a bridge was completed. However, the times were such that a rival company decided to run rails from Brockville via Smiths Falls to Perth, Almont, Arnprior, and the Ottawa River at Sandpoint, primarily to exploit the lumber of the Ottawa Valley. Indeed, this company opened the first tunnel in the Canadas on May 16, 1860. This ran 1/3 of a mile under the town of Brockville to reach the harbor on the St. Lawrence. The Central Canada Railway joined this line from Carleton Place to the Le Breton Flats on the western side of Ottawa. Would it surprise you that I was quietly asked to review the calculations of this tunnel, which was more or less carved through the rock using black powder? Since there would be houses and roads above the tunnel, it was necessary to ensure the bearing capability of the rock once the tunnel had been excavated, and my calculations were along these lines. Some parts of the tunnel needed to be reinforced, but in the section where the rock was solid, there was simply excavation. A lesser problem was to make sure the gradient of the tunnel would drain the inevitable water that would enter from fissures in the rock and from the upper end of the 1,700-foot tunnel. Work on this project had started before I arrived in Montreal, and it lasted until after the Victoria Bridge was in use, even if not officially opened. That I was for much of the year out of Montreal may explain why George was our only child, until Geraldine found she was with child again in the summer of 1858. Unfortunately, she bore a little girl prematurely in January of 1859. The child lived but 5 days. Besides the anguish of a lost child, Geraldine then endured some form of fever that stayed with her on and off until the summer. Indeed, when we took George with us to the opening of the Victoria Bridge, I believe it was the first day when I saw Geraldine smile since Emily had died. At this time, we were living in our own house. Geraldine and I had managed between our arrival, that is before our marriage, and the spring of 1858, to save enough to building lot and materials for a modest house. As an engineer, it was simple for me to design it, and I knew who would give good materials at a fair price. Even better, I had got to know many men who could do the work informally, that is, an hour here and an hour there, when their regular tasks allowed, or when there was one of the many strikes or other 56 interruptions. I was also able to work myself, and even Geraldine undertook very light jobs, as well as ensuring food and drink to keep a positive mood among those working. The memory of this was warm and cozy. Geraldine had been a good partner. Our life together was almost always calm, cordial, and respectful. Of course, I was away from home a great deal. On the other hand, communications around the world were improving through this period, from our arrival in Canada in 1855 to the start of the American Civil War in 1860. We were very excited by the news that a transatlantic cable had passed a telegraphic message in August 1858, then disappointed when the cable failed a few weeks later. It would be almost a decade before a reliable telegraph was established. However, the Royal Mail steamships and the railways allowed that a letter from England to us or vice versa rarely took over a month from posting to arrive. In some ways, this time was fraught with senseless competition for some routes with neglect of others. I have talked of both the Prescott-Bytown and Brockville-Ottawa lines, and even within one project there were conflicts of will. For example, the Brockville and Ottawa Railway wanted to end their line at Brockville with a tunnel, the one I already mentioned, through the hill on which the town was generally situated. Samuel Kiefer, I will surmise as inspector of railways rather than as engineer for the Grand Trunk, was opposed to this, favoring a route that passed around the hill to the west and ran along the shore to the harbor. However, the railway went ahead, and the contractors got into financial difficulty. After much wrangling and several years' delay, the tunnel was finished. And as I said, it was the first tunnel in Canada, with part having man-made support and part borne by the raw Canadian rock. However, Kiefer, through other engineers and contractors, let it be known that I would provide honest estimates of the work and the risks, and I was able to earn some good fees to augment my GTR salary. As I was not greedy, other commissions of a similar nature came my way. Perhaps I should mention that the tunnel was first used on the very last day of 1860. Though that tunnel has served well, it was designed, to my mind at least, too small. At only 14 feet 9 inches high and 14 feet wide at the maximum, the 1721 feet of its length required small locomotives. When the town hall was built over the tunnel, its apparent chimneys were, in fact, ventilation shafts to exhaust smoke from the tunnel. Nevertheless, as Canada's first tunnel, it reflected well on the enterprise of the young country. Clearly, I found the work that came my way interesting. More than interesting, it was exciting. Whenever I came home, Geraldine made sure I had comfort and rest. Remember that much of my time was spent in wilderness and construction sites, amid dirt, wet insects, and vulgar people, mostly men, but sometimes quite rough and often disreputable women. The authorities would sometimes prosecute the operators of bawdy houses for vagrancy, but generally would tolerate them unless there was excessively disorderly behavior. Some of the men I knew would frequent such places. Perhaps they thought me fastidious when I excused myself from accompanying them so that I could review the day's work and calculations. In a way, I was fastidious. My parents and relatives in Tunbridge had provided me a life of security and, in large measure, comfort. It was a life where hearth and home, along with their denizens, were central to all I experienced. But once I was an apprentice, I saw the behavior and difficulties of men and women who did not have the guidance and company of parents and siblings. Thus I was, from time to time, a witness to poverty and disease, particularly diseases spread by depravity. Some will argue this as an absence of moral fortitude. I have neither the inclination nor means to say, but I knew that consorting with street women cost many men their health and took bread from the mouths of those who depended on them. I like pleasure, and sensual pleasure too, but in a well-ordered family. Nor do I believe in being a miser, but I had taken to heart the maxim of Mr. Micawber from David Copperfield, and always spent less than my income. Perhaps these reservations make me dull company. Of course, though I was for much of my time away from home, when I was able to be resident in Montreal, I had Geraldine's company, including in bed at night. From the perspective of the night sleeper to Edinburgh, I fear we were rather formal with each other, even as we passed the nights side by side. Nevertheless, I believe there was contentment, and at the time would have said happiness, though with Amelia my emotions seem much more intense. 58.